It took a bit of time, but I did finally manage to get my hands on the 7-inch Batman figure and his Batcycle from McFarlane Toys. Both of these toys, of course, are based on Robert Pattinson's Batman from The Batman that was recently released. And I was really pleased when they announced they were actually going to release the Batcycle as part of this line, because it adds an extra dimension to your collection and your display options when you're able to put these characters next to a vehicle. And it's always quite fun when we have these larger scale figures with a vehicle as well, which is pretty cool. And I certainly don't have a bike in this scale. So let's start by looking at the packaging. If you've bought any of the other DC Multiverse figures from McFarlane Toys, by now you know what to expect. There's not an awful lot going on in terms of the packaging. It is mostly window display, which is quite nicely done with that blue card in the background having some images from the comic books sort of greyed out in white. The rest of the packaging is pretty bland. It's really just black panels everywhere. In this case, we do have the logo of the Batman at the bottom of the packaging, so I think that works really well. But when we look at the side panel, these boxes are quite chunky, and it always feels like it's a lost opportunity to put some nice artwork here on the side so they display nicely with other figures. But sadly, again, it is just basically a black bar with the name of the character on the side. The back of the box fares a little better though. We do have a nice big image there of a photo shoot of the figure in action, but it does look very authentic to what we actually see on screen. So I think they've done a very nice job of this. This is quite clever photography. And then at the very bottom of the pack, we see the other figures that have been released as part of this wave. So we can see the other characters that were released as part of the Batman wave. I really like this costume in the film, but I was a little bit disappointed when I released this figure from his packaging, as it just seemed a little bit dull and a bit bland in terms of the colouring, so it doesn't immediately strike you visually. But the design itself and the sculpt is very nice. And full kudos to the sculptor, because I think they've done a really excellent job with this head sculpt. They definitely have caught the likeness of Robert Pattinson here, which is a pretty difficult thing to do when you really only have a jawline and eyes to play with. But I think they have actually captured it very, very nicely. This is quite clearly Robert Pattinson's Batman, and I think they've done a really nice job, particularly with the eyes. You can see they're just looking slightly off-center to the side there. These have been very finely painted and it looks really, really good. Sadly, there is a little bit of smudging underneath the mask where the nose meets the mask there, which is a bit of a shame. But other than that, this looks pretty good. This is pretty screen accurate and it looks pretty faithful, which I really, really like. The one thing that did really bother me though, that I noticed only when I was doing this review for this figure, is the bat symbol on the chest looks ever so slightly off, and that's because there's too much of a gap between the two wings. If we look at the actual film, we can see that that is pretty accurate. That bat symbol seems to be multiple pieces joined together, and there's this tiny little triangle of a gap at the bottom there. But on the figure, the actual arms aren't joined, or I should say the wings aren't joined, and there's this huge gaping gap in the center of the bat symbol. And once I've seen it, I can't unsee it, and it really bothers me. But with that being said, I think the rest of the sculpting is really, really nice. We can see all the various bits of the armour, how it connects together. It looks really screen accurate. There's a lot of detail here. There's not a lot in the way of paint apps, but then that's pretty accurate to what we see on screen, so I can't mark it down for that. I do think it looks really good in the main, and I think they've done a pretty nice job of it. He doesn't come with any extra hands, so the hands he does come with is one open hand and one sort of gripping half fist kind of hand. A sort of fairly traditional approach to action figures if you're only giving them one set of hands. The cape is a single rubber piece. It is fairly malleable and flexible, but you can't control it or shape it into any positions that you may want it to be. It's always just going to default to this one position. There's plenty of detail in it in terms of the different folds, which looks good, and there's not an awful lot of surprises when it comes to the articulation. There's a ball joint in the neck, allowing the head to move all the way around 360 degrees if you want it to, and of course he can look up and down. Now there's much more give when it comes to looking up than down, but there is quite a good range of motion here. He has a nice butterfly wing joint in the chest where it meets the ball joint of the shoulder, which is fantastic. So there's an extra bit of give, an extra bit of range of motion here, allowing the arms to kick quite a good distance back and up, which is really, really appreciated. This is really good. There's also an upper bicep swivel as well, and of course double jointed elbow, so he can reach his hand all the way back to his head there, which is fantastic. Now, you'll also notice that at the wrist there is a ball joint here, which is kind of unusual for these figures. I'm used to seeing this on, say, Mafex. I'm not used to seeing it as much on McFarlane Toys, but it works really quite well. So this ball joint allows the wrist to rotate 360 degrees and, of course, hinge forwards and backwards. And it's just got enough distance away from the gauntlet to allow it to be able to do what it needs to do without hindering that motion, which is great. There's another ball joint in the chest, in the upper ab region, so he can move from side to side, he can lean left and right, and he can also bend forwards and backwards, and this is supported by a final ball joint in the waist. And as you can see, there's a pretty good range of motion here when it comes to bending forwards and backwards, particularly backwards, but all the way around, this is pretty good, solid stuff. Now, there's ball joints in the hips, of course, allowing those legs to kick out to the side and backwards. Sadly, there is no thigh swivel, which is a shame, but the legs do kick forward a really good distance, and they kick back a really good distance too. This is complemented by a double jointed knee, so those legs can kick all the way to his back there, which looks really, really good. And then finally, there is another ball joint at the ankle there, allowing the foot to rotate from side to side, hinge forwards and backwards, and there is even toe articulation. So pretty solid stuff here. Sadly, he is very, very light on accessories. He comes with a stand and this grappling gun. This is one piece. There's some decent detailing in the sculpt, but there's no paint apps whatsoever. Now, he can hold it by the handle in his left hand, and it's a pretty good fit and it looks okay. But there is a peg hole on the open right hand, and there is that little peg there on the grapple gun, which means it can slide into his hand there, so it looks like he's holding it. And this should look okay, but it actually looks a little bit silly because it just doesn't look natural, like he's holding it properly. He's certainly not holding it by the handle, and it just looks a little bit clunky to me. In terms of comparison, here he is standing next to the McFarlane Toys Arkham Asylum Batman. As you can see, they're pretty comparable in terms of height, although the Arkham Batman does have those really tall ears, so he does have this slight height advantage over the Batman. And here he is next to the gold label Batman Year 2 from McFarlane Toys. Now, I have to say that this Batman actually does seem to be a little bit taller, and it's not just the ears. I actually think all over this figure is just slightly broader, slightly taller. And when you put them together, you can really see a huge contrast, a really strong difference between each of these Batman figures, which is kind of cool, actually. Moving on to the Batcycle, of course, this is presented in a landscape box, so a little bit different to what we're used to seeing in this line. It follows the same branding and design scheme as we saw with the Batman figure. It is mostly window display with those big black panels and a small logo from the film. Again, the chunky side panel, mostly gone to waste. It just has the logo and the name of the Batcycle on it. And the reverse of the packaging once again has the other figures in this wave that you can pick up, the other characters from this film. Now, I have to say, the sculpting of this bike is very nicely done. There's a lot of details on it. There's some nice paint taps here and there as well. Overall, it is pretty much a matte black, which is a little bit bland as we saw with the Batman costume. But overall, its look and aesthetic is pretty screen accurate. It looks pretty faithful to what we saw in the movie, which is great. And I think it's a quite nicely designed bike. Most of the opportunities for creative sculpting and fantastic paint apps are around the engine, and I think they've done a pretty good job of this. There's lots of bolts and wires and bits and pieces which look really nicely done. There's some nice paint washes running over this to make it look a bit lived in, a bit worn, a bit more realistic and textured, which is really effective, and I think they've done a really good job of this. Thankfully, the handlebars are linked through the steering to the wheel, so you can turn the wheel from side to side, which is a nice touch. I do appreciate that, but there's not an awful lot of detailing on the handlebars themselves or on that sort of dashboard that we can see there. Sadly, there is no speedometer or any detailing like that, which would have been really nice to see a bit more detail there. Likewise, the wing mirrors are just blacked out as a plastic, but it's a shame they didn't put like little stickers, little mirrored stickers on there or something to just, actually look a bit more like wing mirrors and reflect the background. That would have been a really cool, lovely little touch which would have made a big difference here. Another missed opportunity, in my opinion, is when we look at the bat-shaped headpiece that we have at the front of the bike. We have that big bright light. This has just been painted in. As you can see on mine, there's a little chip there, which ruins the effect somewhat, but nevertheless, this has been painted to create the effect of the light being switched on. And I think it would have been really, really cool if they could have actually had this as a working light. I think it would have been such a small thing that would have been really, really impactful. This could have been battery operated, and I think it would have been really fun to be able to flick a switch and have the light actually beam into life. That would have been awesome. And then finally, of course, we have the tyres, which are a nice thick rubber. The tyre at the back is much chunkier and thicker than the front tyre. They both spin around, and it does come with a display base to be able to slot into the rear tyre and hold it into position to allow the bike to stand on its own and to be able to be put on display. Meanwhile, the front of the bike, obviously, we have some nice paint apps here, a much thinner wheel, but again, a nice thick tread on the tyre, which is really fun. Now, with the bike comes an extra hand for the Batman figure. Obviously, McFarlane have realised that he doesn't have two gripping hands on the original figure, so they've included this extra one here, which allows him to grip the handlebar with both hands. And for the most part, this works pretty well. He can grip it nice and easily. It looks like it slots into place nice and tightly, which is great. So the visual's quite good. It definitely has him leaning forwards though, so you can't really have him sitting on the seat. His arms will not stretch. So you are quite limited in terms of what position you can put him in. Also, you can't slot his feet into any peg holes to keep him in position, so you are really limited to this one position, which looks okay for the most part, pretty accurate to what we see on screen, because he does seem to be leaning forwards on his bike most of the time. But if you wanted him to sit back, then his arms are not going to reach the handlebars, and it's going to look a little bit weird. But you do have the option and the pleasure of being able to ride Batman around on his bike there. And it looks pretty cool. And I must say, it is fun to be able to do this. So then, final thoughts? Well, for me, I think it's going to have to be 4-star for both Batman and the bike. I think these are really fun action figures. I think they've done a really nice job of both the scale, the sculpting, the paint apps where they are applied look really good, and the articulation and the movements of both these figures and Cycle work really well in the main. That said, there is something a little bit dull about the appearance. I wish there'd been something to just help them pop a little bit more. I think there's a couple of missed opportunities. As I said, the light on the bike would have been nice. Maybe the rear view wing mirrors would have been really cool to have done something with that. And for the Batman himself, perhaps a couple of more gadgets would have been nice. I really wish they'd done something about that bat symbol on the chest, because that really bothers me. And sadly, it just falls slightly short of expectations when it comes to the scaling of the Batman on the Batcycle. It does feel like it doesn't quite work, like it's not quite in proportion, because the Batman has to lean over so much. He can't sit back and be able to reach the handlebars. It doesn't look quite right when he is perched on it. Somehow it just doesn't look quite natural. Now that might be down to me and how I'm positioning it, but it just doesn't feel quite right. But it does look good from certain angles, so it's all about how you put it on display, I suppose. But all in all, I think it's really fun. I'm really glad to have both of these in my collection. I think it's very nice. I'm really glad that we got the Batcycle, because it definitely completes the look for this Batman. It could only be better if they actually produced a Batmobile. That would be amazing, but we will see. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.